Sherlock Holmes and the Vanishing Violinist, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1, The Missing Virtuoso. It was on the eve of a momentous occasion in the musical world, a night that was to herald the debut of one of the most promising talents the world had ever seen, that a strange disturbance befell the London air. As the city's gas lamps flickered faintly under the creeping fog, a tale of intrigue began to unfold in the drawing room of 221B Baker Street. The unmistakable clink of a telegram under the door broke the stillness, the crisp sound reverberating in the otherwise quiet space. Sherlock Holmes, seated in his usual armchair, his long fingers curled around a half-finished violin sonata, glanced up with piercing eyes. His mind had already anticipated the disturbance long before it arrived. There were few mysteries that could truly ruffle his composure, but the air in London seemed ripe with secrets, and Holmes, as ever, was hungry for the chase. "Watson?" Holmes called softly, his voice betraying an undercurrent of anticipation. I was sitting at the fireplace, attempting to organize the notes for my latest manuscript, but at his summons, I dropped everything, instinctively reaching for the telegram. "The usual?" I inquired, having grown accustomed to the cryptic nature of the messages Holmes received. "Not quite," Holmes answered, his tone enigmatic. "Read it aloud, Watson." I tore open the envelope and unfurled the message, deciphering the hurried handwriting. "Urgent. The great violinist, Elias Trevane, has vanished. He was last seen in rehearsal at the Royal Albert Hall. His debut performance tomorrow night is in jeopardy. Please come at once. We need your assistance. D.S. Edmund Graves, Scotland Yard." I looked up, meeting Holmes's expectant gaze. "A renowned violinist disappeared?" I muttered, surprised. How terribly mysterious. What could have happened to him? Holmes was already standing, his mind already racing ahead of me. "Trevane is a prodigy, Watson. His skill with the violin is beyond that of any living musician, a sensation, if you will. And yet, his name does not merely evoke admiration, but the venom of envy. His disappearance is not an accident, I'm certain of it." I stared at him in bewilderment. Envy? But surely his reputation would only make him a target for admiration, not malice. Holmes gave me a sharp look, his eyes narrowing, before answering with a half-smile that was more a flash of calculation than warmth. "Envy, Watson, is a powerful motivator. Among the ranks of the most gifted, it is often the shadow that lurks most fiercely." I stood to fetch my coat. "It sounds as if we are going to the Royal Albert Hall, then?" Holmes nodded, already reaching for his iconic deerstalker hat. "Indeed, we are. But first, Watson, I suspect that we may not be dealing with the mere disappearance of a man, but something far darker, a dangerous game involving those who inhabit the world of art and fame." The streets of London, dim and fog-cloaked, greeted us with the familiar blend of sounds, the hum of horse-drawn carriages, the murmur of distant conversations, and the occasional shout of a street vendor. As we approached the Royal Albert Hall, Holmes's demeanor became more focused, his sharp eyes scanning the crowds for anything out of place. We were met at the entrance by a tall, thin man, his face drawn and weary, as though he had been battling with some unseen foe for far too long. "Inspector Graves," Holmes greeted him coolly, his voice exuding both familiarity and authority. "What can you tell me of this disappearance?" The inspector, whose uniform was slightly askew, led us inside to a small, dimly lit room. "Trevane was in the midst of his final rehearsal," Graves explained, his voice tinged with frustration. "He played perfectly. There were no signs of distress. But just after the rehearsal, he simply vanished. No one saw him leave the building, and no one knows where he's gone." "Is there any indication of foul play?" Holmes asked, his voice measured. Graves nodded slowly. "We've scoured the premises. No sign of a struggle, no signs of violence. But," he hesitated for a moment, clearly reluctant to speak further, "there's something peculiar about his last performance. We found a recording, the final piece of his rehearsal. The sound is unsettling, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's interest was piqued. "Unsettling?" he asked, his tone sharp with curiosity. "Do you have it?" Graves walked over to a small gramophone resting in the corner of the room, an old-fashioned device but still functional. He inserted a record and set the needle in place. As the machine whirred to life, the soft strains of a violin echoed through the room, melodic and beautiful at first, but as the piece progressed, the tone began to shift, growing more discordant, more frantic. The bow on the strings seemed to tremble with fear, as if the player was being forced into a rhythm they could not control. At times, the music seemed to falter, as though the violinist was not playing but struggling against something unseen. "Good heavens," I murmured, instinctively reaching for my medical bag. "This is not the sound of a man in control of his craft." Holmes, however, remained motionless, listening intently. His brow furrowed, as if he were deciphering a code hidden within the music itself. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, eager to understand his assessment. "It is subtle," he replied, his voice low. "The music, it speaks of panic, but not of mere panic. There is something more, something underlying it, a note that should not be there, a disturbance as if an external force were at play." He turned to Graves. "Where was this recording made?" "In the hall itself, sir, during the last rehearsal. We've checked the hall. No one saw him leave, but his dressing room was empty when we arrived." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sudden realization. "He didn't leave on his own accord," he murmured. "Someone forced him to abandon the stage." Graves nodded, his face grim. "That's what we feared, but we found no trace of the culprit." Holmes's gaze grew intense. "I must see his dressing room immediately." The dressing room was eerily silent, the air still with the scent of varnished wood and polished brass. It was a small, intimate space, a contrast to the grandiose hall itself. Holmes wasted no time in examining every corner, his sharp eyes scanning the floor, the furniture, the walls. He seemed to know exactly what he was searching for, as if the room itself was speaking to him in a language I could not understand. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he bent down to inspect the floor near the violinist's small writing desk. There, in the dim light, he found it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratch on the wooden surface. It was barely noticeable, but to Holmes it was a glaring clue. "A struggle, Watson," he muttered under his breath. Someone attempted to force him to write something. But what? He carefully examined the desk, and his fingers brushed over a letter. Half finished, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted midway. It was addressed to someone named Eleanor, but the message itself was incomplete. "Do you see, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice low with excitement. "This letter, Trevane was trying to communicate with someone. But why was he interrupted?" I leaned closer to the desk, noting the hurried nature of the letter. It was clear now. Alistair Trevane had been compelled to leave something unsaid, to abandon his final words in a moment of crisis. And yet, the question still lingered in the air. Who had forced him to vanish, and why? Holmes turned to Graves, his expression a mask of determination. "We must speak to those who know him best, the members of his orchestra, his colleagues in the arts. Someone among them must know the truth." The mystery deepened, and with it, the dark currents of envy and betrayal that swirled within the world of London's musical elite. We were only at the beginning, but already the shadows were lengthening. Chapter 2. The Phantom of the Orchestra. The next morning, as the mist of dawn settled over London's streets, Sherlock Holmes and I made our way to the offices of the Royal Academy of Music. The towering building loomed before us, a fortress of classical stonework that housed the brightest stars of the musical world. It was a world of discipline, elegance, and, like all worlds of great creativity, hidden rivalries and dark secrets. Holmes had insisted that the key to understanding Trevane's disappearance lay not just in his last rehearsal, but in the relationships he had fostered and, perhaps, the enemies he had unknowingly made. We were met in the Academy's grand lobby by a flustered young woman who introduced herself as Miss Beatrice Fletcher, Trevane's assistant. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, as though she had not slept in days. Despite her composure, I could tell the disappearance had rattled her more than she let on. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted us, her voice trembling with a mixture of distress and desperation. I don't know what to do. Everyone's in a panic, and Alistair is missing. How could this happen? How could he just disappear?" Holmes offered a slight nod, his gaze calm yet intense. "Miss Fletcher, we must gather all the facts. Tell me, how well did you know Mr. Trevane? Were there any signs, anything that might indicate someone wanted to harm him?" She hesitated for a moment, looking uncertain, but then she spoke, her voice growing softer. Alistair was an exceptional man, but he was not always easy to be around. He was perfectionistic, sometimes to a fault. He had a habit of pushing everyone around him, including the orchestra members. But, her voice faltered, but I never imagined anyone would harm him. He was so focused on his music. His debut at the Royal Albert Hall was going to be his moment. He was so excited. Excited, I asked, leaning forward. Did he say anything to you before the rehearsal that might indicate something was wrong? Perhaps he confided in you, or nothing, she interrupted, shaking her head with a soft sob. He seemed agitated, but not in a way that made me think he was in danger. He mentioned a problem with one of the violinists in the orchestra, but he didn't go into details. It's strange. He was always worried about the performance, but he seemed to have a renewed energy just before the last rehearsal. It was almost as though something was propelling him forward. Holmes's expression remained unchanged, though the faintest flicker of something deeper, curiosity perhaps, passed through his eyes. A renewed energy, you say, and you mentioned a problem with one of the violinists. Which member of the orchestra was he speaking of? Bartholomew Harris, Miss Fletcher replied without hesitation. He's Trevane's principal's second violinist. There's been some tension between them lately. It's subtle, but you can feel it. Harris has been on edge, and it's strange. He's a good violinist, but something about him just doesn't sit right with me. He's been distant. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already working through the new information. Tell me, Miss Fletcher, where can we find Mr. Harris now? He's likely at his flat, she replied, her voice strained. But I must warn you, he's not the most cooperative person. He's always been a bit of an enigma, and after Trevane's disappearance, he's been avoiding contact with everyone. Then it seems we must pay him a visit, Holmes said with a glint of determination. Dr. Watson, let us proceed. The flat of Bartholomew Harris was located in a quiet neighborhood just beyond the reach of the bustling crowds, in a building that looked more suited to a retired banker than a musician. The smell of old wood and faded wallpaper greeted us as we ascended the stairs to his second-floor apartment. Holmes paused briefly before knocking on the door, his brow furrowed in thought. You have a theory, Holmes? I asked, my curiosity mounting. Perhaps, Holmes replied, his voice low. If Mr. Harris is involved in this, we may discover his role in Trevane's disappearance through the subtle clues he has left behind. Before I could respond, the door creaked open, and a tall, gaunt figure appeared in the doorway. Bartholomew Harris had a sharp, angular face, his eyes dark and hollow, as though he hadn't slept for days. His hair was unkempt, and his attire, once pristine, looked as though it had been hastily thrown on in a state of agitation. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Harris greeted us in a voice that was almost too calm, considering the circumstances. What brings you here? I haven't seen you at the academy. Is this about Trevane? Indeed it is, Holmes replied coolly. We have reason to believe that you may have some insight into Mr. Trevane's disappearance. We understand that there have been tensions between you two recently. Care to explain? The violinist's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, a hint of unease passed across his features. But he quickly masked it with a haughty air. Tensions? It's hardly surprising. Trevane's ego has always been insufferable. He thinks he owns the orchestra. But let me make it clear, I have no part in his disappearance. Holmes's eyes never left him, his piercing gaze as unwavering as ever. I did not suggest you were directly involved, Mr. Harris, but your relationship with the missing violinist might hold clues. Tell me, what happened during the final rehearsal? Was there anything unusual about Trevane's behavior? Harris's lips tightened, and he crossed his arms defensively. Unusual? Trevane was Trevane. Always pushing us, always demanding more, never satisfied. But I did notice something strange toward the end of the rehearsal. He seemed distracted, almost as though he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, when the piece ended, he rushed out of the hall without saying a word to anyone. Did he speak to you directly? Holmes pressed. No, Harris replied curtly, his voice tight, but it was clear that something was off. He didn't look like himself, as though something was weighing on him. Holmes nodded, his mind already racing. And after the rehearsal, did you have any further contact with him? No, Harris answered, his tone flat. I've had no contact with anyone from the orchestra since last night. Holmes's sharp eyes searched the room as if looking for something Harris might be hiding. His gaze lingered on a violin case resting against the wall, its surface polished to a gleaming sheen. Without a word, Holmes moved toward it, his fingers brushing against the case with an almost reverential touch. It was a Stradivarius, unmistakable in its elegance and value, Trevane's prized possession, I suspected. "Ah," Holmes muttered, his voice soft with intrigue. "It seems your violin has seen better days, Mr. Harris." Harris stiffened. "What do you mean by that?" Holmes's fingers lightly traced a faint mark on the violin's surface. "This scratch, it is fresh, and it is not from a bow. It is too deliberate, as if someone had forced the instrument against a hard surface." Harris's expression faltered for a moment before he quickly regained his composure. "You're mistaken, Holmes. It's nothing." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "No, Mr. Harris, it is not nothing. It is a clue. And you, like everyone else, have been caught in the web of this strange mystery. The question is, how far are you willing to go to hide the truth?" Harris's lips twitched, a barely perceptible sign of discomfort. "I have nothing to hide." "Then," Holmes said smoothly, "perhaps you can tell us what this mark signifies. A mark that, I suspect, will soon unravel everything." I watched Harris's eyes dart nervously around the room, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of guilt in them. But he said nothing. As we left Bartholomew Harris's flat, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something far darker than a simple disappearance. Holmes's intuition was always sharper than my own, and his keen observations had only deepened the mystery. One thing was certain, the secrets of Trevane's vanishing were buried deep within the world of music, of envy and of hidden rivalries. And no matter how carefully Harris tried to mask his emotions, he was already slipping up. Holmes turned to me, his face calm yet determined. "The next step is clear, Watson. We must look deeper into Trevane's past, for the answer to his disappearance lies not just in the present, but in the shadows of his past, where the true motives lie." And with that, the chase for the truth continued, a chase that promised to unravel the very heart of London's artistic elite. Chapter 3: The Ghost of Rivalry. The sun hung low over London as the fog that had smothered the city during the early hours began to lift, leaving behind a crisp, almost metallic air. Holmes and I walked briskly through the streets toward the office of a man whose name had surfaced in our investigation, Julius Blackwood, a well-known patron of the arts and a notorious benefactor to some of the most prominent musicians in London. It was said that his wealth was vast, his influence greater still, and his interests both varied and discreet. A man like Blackwood, I thought, could hold a key to understanding the darker undercurrents of the world Trevane inhabited. Holmes had been unusually quiet since our visit to Bartholomew Harris's flat, his mind working through a maze of possibilities. The violinist's behavior, his sudden nervousness, the scratched surface of the instrument, it all suggested something far more intricate than a simple disappearance. There was a deeper, more insidious element at play, and Holmes was determined to find it. "Holmes," I ventured, my voice breaking the silence as we navigated the bustling crowds. "What exactly do you suspect? That Harris has something to do with Trevane's vanishing?" Holmes's eyes remained fixed ahead, his face unreadable. "Harris is a suspect, Watson, but I am far from convinced that he is the mastermind behind this. His reaction to my questions seemed disingenuous, but I believe he is merely a player in a larger scheme, perhaps a pawn caught in a web he cannot escape." I raised an eyebrow. "A pawn? But what of the others? The musicians, the patrons, the people around Trevane?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, his voice laced with intrigue. "Trevane's disappearance is not the work of a single individual. It is the product of many forces: envy, pride, ambition. There are those who stand to gain from his absence, and they are the ones we must find. But before we can uncover them, we must first understand the environment in which Trevane lived, and the people who inhabited it." As if to punctuate his statement, we arrived at the grand entrance to Blackwood's estate, a sprawling mansion situated on the outskirts of the city, a place of both opulence and seclusion. The iron gates creaked open at our approach, and we were greeted by a prim butler who led us into a drawing room that felt more like a small museum. with walls adorned with paintings of various composers, musicians, and aristocrats. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of high society. Julius Blackwood himself was a tall man, his figure imposing and dignified, but his expression was one of cold calculation. His sharp eyes, framed by graying temples, seemed to appraise us the moment we entered, as though he were sizing up our very souls. A man like Blackwood exuded authority, and his presence alone made the room feel charged with power. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Blackwood greeted us smoothly, his voice low but rich. "What an unexpected visit. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes did not flinch in the face of Blackwood's imposing nature. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We are investigating the disappearance of Elias Trevane, Mr. Blackwood. We understand that you are both a patron of the arts and a close associate of many musicians, including Trevane. We'd appreciate any insight you might have into his life and his sudden disappearance." Blackwood's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Trevane, yes. A brilliant violinist, a man of exceptional talent. I had the pleasure of meeting him at several soirees and performances. But you must forgive me, gentlemen. I cannot fathom why you've come to me. I know very little of his personal affairs. Only that he was an ambitious young man with a promising career." Holmes's sharp gaze did not soften. "Ambitious indeed. But you must admit, Mr. Blackwood, that a man of Trevane's caliber would have had enemies, perhaps even rivals who would have seen his rising star as a threat. Are you saying that there is no one who might have had cause to harm him?" Blackwood's expression remained unchanged, but there was the briefest flicker in his eyes, something calculating, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "Rivals? In the world of music, there is no shortage of those. But harm? I highly doubt it. Music, after all, is an art meant to unite, not divide." Holmes studied Blackwood for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the subtle cues of the man's behavior. "You are a patron, Mr. Blackwood. You know as well as anyone that competition in the arts can breed resentment, jealousy, even hatred. It is said that Trevane had an unsettling effect on some of his colleagues. Have you heard anything of that?" For the first time, a shadow crossed Blackwood's features. "I don't concern myself with petty rivalries, Mr. Holmes. I am a supporter of talent, not drama." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But perhaps you know more than you let on. Perhaps you know that there are those who would stop at nothing to silence a rival. Trevane was a rising star, but not everyone in the musical world viewed him with admiration. You, Mr. Blackwood, may have more insight into this than you realize." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Blackwood seemed to gather himself, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I know nothing more than what I've already told you. If Trevane is missing, then I suggest you speak to those who were closest to him. Perhaps one of his colleagues or friends could shed light on his disappearance. But I'm afraid I cannot help you further." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I see. Very well, Mr. Blackwood, we shall take our leave. But rest assured, the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried." With that, Holmes turned on his heel, his coat swishing as he made for the door. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts urging me to stay and press further. But Holmes's unspoken command was clear. We would learn what we needed to know in time. As we exited Blackwood's mansion, the chill of the evening air bit into my skin, but it did little to cool the fire of curiosity that burned within me. Holmes had not spoken a word since our conversation with the patron, but I could tell that his mind was working at a pace that left no room for distraction. "Holmes," I asked as we made our way down the winding path, "what did you make of Blackwood's reaction?" Holmes's eyes flickered to me for just a moment before returning to the road ahead. "Blackwood is a man who deals in power, Watson. He is the kind of man who controls the narrative. His denial is almost too perfect, too rehearsed. He knows more than he lets on, but he is hiding something. Something crucial. But why would he hide it?" I pressed. "If he's merely a patron, why get involved in Trevane's disappearance?" "Because, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tinged with a quiet certainty, "Blackwood's ties to Trevane run deeper than simple patronage. There is more to this story than simple rivalry. Blackwood's influence in the arts is vast, and if Trevane's disappearance threatens that, He may very well have the motive to ensure it stays hidden. I was struck by the possibility. You think Blackwood is involved then? Holmes's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I believe that Blackwood is part of a larger network of people who have a vested interest in Trevane's absence. We have seen the shadows cast by ambition, envy, and rivalry. But now, Watson, we must shine a light into those shadows. There are forces at work here that we have yet to uncover. And with that, the pursuit of the truth grew even more elusive, and yet more urgent. As we walked away from Blackwood's mansion and into the encroaching night, the mysteries of Alastair Trevane's disappearance deepened, and the forces behind them began to reveal themselves in the most unexpected of ways. Chapter 4. The Dance of Deception. The days that followed our visit to Julius Blackwood's mansion were filled with an unsettling stillness. Holmes's mind seemed to be working in overdrive, but he remained quiet and contemplative, his thoughts evidently moving along a labyrinthine path of deductions. Our inquiries had turned up little from Blackwood, though I could tell from the way Holmes had scrutinized the man's every word and gesture that he suspected the patron's involvement, either directly or indirectly, in the mystery of Alastair Trevane's disappearance. However, the faintest shift in our investigation came when we received an unexpected visit. It was late one evening, as the lamps along Baker Street flickered in the gathering twilight, that our doorbell rang. I rose from my chair, curious as to who might be seeking us out at this hour. A young woman stood in the doorway, her delicate features drawn tight with anxiety. Her eyes were wide with uncertainty, and her voice quivered as she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I need your help." Her words were rushed, but there was a certain quiet desperation in them that immediately piqued my curiosity. Holmes, who had been seated at the fireplace, his fingers steepled in thought, looked up sharply. "You come at an interesting time, miss?" "Victoria Trevane," she replied quickly. "I'm Alastair's sister." The name sent a jolt through me. Alastair Trevane's sister. How had we not thought to seek her out before? We had learned little about his family, save for a few scattered mentions of a sibling. Her presence now could very well be the key that would unlock the truth behind her brother's disappearance. Holmes gestured for her to sit. "Please, Miss Trevane, tell us what brings you here." Victoria entered the room hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she sat opposite Holmes and me. She seemed out of place in the cozy, dimly lit sitting room, as if the heavy weight of something unbearable pressed down on her slender shoulders. "My brother, Alastair, has been missing for days now," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I've gone to the police, but they're not doing enough. They don't understand him. They don't understand the world he lived in. I thought that maybe, if I came to you, you might be able to help. I need to know what happened to him." Holmes's sharp eyes never left her face. "You must understand, Miss Trevane, that we are investigating many leads. Your brother's disappearance appears to be the result of more than mere circumstance. There are powerful forces at play, forces that we have only just begun to understand." Her face paled further. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "Alastair he was passionate about his music. It was everything to him. But there were people, Mr. Holmes. There were people who didn't want him to succeed." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice calm yet pressing. "Can you tell us more about these people? Who were they, and what could they possibly have against your brother?" Victoria's eyes darkened, and for a moment I could see the tremor of a deeper emotion within her, something that went beyond fear. "There were rivals, of course," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "In the music world, it's a constant battle. But there was one person in particular who I think might have been involved in something darker." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Who?" "Bartholomew Harris," she said, the name slipping from her lips like an accusation. "He was my brother's second violinist. They were always at odds. Alastair he was always a perfectionist. He demanded the best from everyone, and Harris couldn't take it. He wanted to be the lead, you see. He thought he was better than my brother." I felt a surge of recognition. Bartholomew Harris, so it seemed that his jealousy and rivalry with Trevane ran deeper than I had initially suspected. But what of the rest of it? Why did Victoria seem so certain that Harris was connected to her brother's disappearance? Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "Why do you think Harris is involved, Miss Trevane?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, as though gathering the courage to speak her next words. Because of what I found. I went through Alistair's things last night, his personal letters, his journals, and I found something strange. There was a letter, an unsigned letter, in one of his violin cases. It was threatening, but vague. It said that Alistair was overstepping his bounds, that he was playing a dangerous game, and it was signed simply with the initials BH. Holmes's face remained an inscrutable mask, but I could see the flicker of interest in his eyes. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. "You believe this letter is from Bartholomew Harris?" I asked. "I don't know for sure," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "But I know my brother's enemies, and Harris is the only one who would have dared to do something like that." Holmes stood suddenly, pacing to the window as he looked out into the night. "A dangerous game," he muttered to himself. "What does it mean? What does Harris have to do with this? And what exactly is he threatening Trevane with?" I turned to Victoria, my mind racing with questions. "You said your brother was passionate about his music? Was there anything in his personal life, anything he might have been involved in that could have led to this rivalry?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Alistair had a secret," she said quietly. "He was involved with someone I don't think he should have been involved with. It wasn't a romantic relationship, but it was a dangerous one. And I think that whoever was behind his disappearance might be connected to that." Holmes turned sharply. "What kind of relationship was it, Miss Trevane?" "I don't know the details," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Alistair was always so guarded about it. He spoke in whispers when he thought I wasn't listening, and sometimes I could hear him arguing with someone. It wasn't just about music, I'm certain of it. It was something much darker." Holmes stood silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed as he processed the new information. "A secret," he repeated, his mind clearly working at full speed. "It seems that your brother's life, Miss Trevane, was far more complicated than even you knew." I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "But what does it mean, Mr. Holmes? Where is he? Why would someone want to hurt him?" Holmes's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at her. "We are not certain yet, Miss Trevane, but we are getting closer. I suspect your brother's disappearance is the result of a confluence of factors. Rivalry, ambition, and something far darker than mere jealousy. You have provided us with an invaluable clue. We will not stop until we find the truth." As she stood to leave, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and despair, she paused at the door. Please, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Find him." Holmes gave a small, reassuring nod. "We will." As the door closed behind Victoria, I turned to Holmes, who had already resumed his pacing. "So," I said, "Bartholomew Harris seems to be the central figure in this web of intrigue. But the letter, the secret relationship, and the references to dangerous games. Holmes, this is turning into something far more complex than we initially thought." Holmes's eyes sparkled with a quiet intensity. "Indeed, Watson. We are dealing with a multifaceted puzzle. Rivalry, envy, ambition, and now the specter of something more sinister. I suspect that someone is playing a game far beyond what we first imagined, and I believe they will stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." "Then what's our next step?" I asked. "We visit Bartholomew Harris once again," Holmes said, his voice steely. "This time, I believe we'll find the answers we need. The hunt was on, and this time, we were closing in on the truth." Chapter 5. The Violinist's Shadow. The following morning, we set out for Bartholomew Harris's residence, a modest townhouse tucked away in the quieter reaches of the West End. The streets around it were lined with townhouses of varying degrees of grandeur, some boasting intricate ironwork and marble facades, while others were more plainly constructed, like Harris's own. The contrast spoke to the man himself, a musician of modest origins, with a reputation that had risen as steadily as it had steeped in envy and rivalry. He had no taste for ostentation, but he had also cultivated a reputation that would be hard to ignore. Holmes's sharp eyes were already scanning the street when we arrived, his face set in its usual expression of intense concentration. We had learned much from our previous inquiries, but there was still the missing link, the final thread to tie everything together. The letter Victoria Trevane had found in her brother's violin case had been signed B.H., and her suspicions pointed firmly toward Harris. If Trevane had felt threatened by him, there was certainly more to uncover. As we approached the front door, a sudden unease gripped me. I had always been one to appreciate the subtlety of music, but there was something about this case that felt dissonant, as if the harmony had been broken and the notes of the investigation were shifting unpredictably. Holmes rang the bell with his usual confident air, and within moments a servant answered the door. The butler, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression, seemed unsurprised to see us. It was clear that Harris's household was used to visitors from the more discreet corners of society. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson," the butler greeted us stiffly, his tone betraying no hint of surprise. "Mr. Harris is expecting you." With little more than a slight nod, he ushered us into a small drawing room. The space was dimly lit, with dark wood paneling and plush furniture that exuded a quiet elegance. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys dusted with age, and there were several violins carefully arranged in glass cases, like relics of a past long gone. Moments later, Bartholomew Harris entered the room. He was dressed simply, yet his attire was clearly well-tailored, reflecting his status in the musical world. He was tall, with sharp features that could have been handsome had they not been marred by a certain brooding intensity. His eyes, though, were the most unsettling part of him. They were dark, almost lifeless, as though years of competition and resentment had drained the warmth from them. His expression was unreadable, yet there was something in the way he held himself, an air of someone constantly on edge. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Harris greeted us coolly, his voice smooth but strained. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. I understand you are looking into my colleague's disappearance?" Holmes studied Harris for a long moment before responding. "Yes, Mr. Harris. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Alistair Trevane. His absence, as you know, has raised several questions." Harris gave a short, almost dismissive laugh. Trevane was a talented man, but one who, I fear, never fully understood the nature of the game. Competition in music is fierce, Mr. Holmes. We all have to fight for our place, and some are better at it than others. Holmes's gaze narrowed slightly. "Is that how you would characterize your relationship with Mr. Trevane? A competition?" Harris stiffened imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Competition is a natural part of the artistic world, isn't it? Especially when it comes to a performance as important as the one he had lined up at the Royal Albert Hall. We all have our roles to play." Holmes took a step forward, his eyes piercing through Harris as though seeking the truth hidden beneath his words. "What if I were to tell you that Mr. Trevane's disappearance is more than just a result of competition? That it might be connected to a rivalry far more dangerous than you realize?" Harris's expression flickered for a moment, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He crossed the room to stand by the grand piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys, without actually pressing them. "I think," he said softly, his back still turned to us, "that you are reaching for shadows, Mr. Holmes. My relationship with Alistair was complicated, yes, but I have no interest in seeing him harmed, nor do I have the motive to make him vanish." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet, I have it on good authority that you were not on the best of terms with him. I've been told that your rivalry went beyond the stage and into your personal lives." At this, Harris finally turned to face us, his expression hardening. "I don't deny that we had our differences. Alistair was a perfectionist, and he had a way of making those around him feel inferior. But to suggest that I am somehow involved in his disappearance is absurd. I have far more important matters to focus on." I watched closely as Holmes absorbed every word. The man's dismissive tone suggested a deflection of sorts, as though he were trying too hard to distance himself from the matter at hand. It was a classic tactic, and I could tell Holmes was not swayed. "I must admit," Holmes continued, his voice calm yet incisive, "that I'm curious about the letter. The one found in Alistair's violin case. It was signed with the initials B.H., coincidentally, the same initials you bear. Can you tell me about it?" Harris's face stiffened, his jaw tightening as he took a step toward us. "What are you implying, Holmes?" "I am not implying anything," Holmes replied evenly. "I'm simply asking for clarification. What did you mean by your words in that letter? The one that threatened Alistair for overstepping his bounds?" For a moment, the room was deathly silent. The tension between us crackled in the air like static before a storm. Harris looked at Holmes with a mixture of disbelief and anger. But beneath the surface, I could see a flicker of something deeper, something closer to fear. "You've misinterpreted the letter," Harris said after a long pause, his voice low and controlled. "It was an unfortunate mistake, a note I wrote in the heat of an argument. But it was nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing at all." Holmes remained silent for a beat, studying Harris with keen eyes. "A mistake? Interesting, but how curious that it found its way into Trevane's violin case. You see, Mr. Harris, I don't believe in coincidences, and I certainly don't believe in the notion of an idle threat." The room grew still again, the tension unbearable. Harris shifted uncomfortably but maintained his facade of calm. Holmes, sensing the shift, pressed on. "Tell me, Mr. Harris, when was the last time you saw Alistair Trevane before his disappearance? Did anything unusual happen during your last interaction?" Harris's lips curled slightly into a thin smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "We had a disagreement, as I've said. But I am a professional. I would never let something so trivial disrupt my performance or career." Holmes did not falter. "Of course, but you must understand, Mr. Harris, that we are pursuing every lead. And one of those leads suggests that your rivalry with Trevane was more than just a simple disagreement. It may have gone far deeper than you are willing to admit." Harris stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Holmes, his fingers now tapping rhythmically on the edge of the piano. "I've told you all I know. If you want to find out what happened to Trevane, you should look elsewhere. There are far more pressing matters in the world of music than petty rivalries, Mr. Holmes. Good day." With that, he turned sharply and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall like the closing of a door on a chapter we had yet to fully understand. Holmes and I exchanged a look. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lips, "it seems Mr. Harris is more than just a competitor. He is hiding something that goes far beyond mere rivalry." I nodded. "And what do we do now?" Holmes straightened up, his gaze distant as he turned toward the door. "Now, Watson, we need to look more closely at Harris's connections, his past, the people he associates with. And we must continue our search for Alistair Trevane. The violinist may have vanished, but the shadows that follow him remain." And so the hunt continued, deeper into the web of jealousy, betrayal, and secrets that wound their way through the tangled world of music and art. And as always, Sherlock Holmes was the only one who could cut through the darkness to find the truth. Chapter 6. The Crescendo of Lies. The days following our visit to Bartholomew Harris were marked by an increasing sense of urgency. Holmes, as always, was relentlessly driven, piecing together fragments of information in a manner that left little room for doubt in my mind that we were closing in on something far more sinister than I had originally believed. Trevane's disappearance was no simple matter. It was becoming increasingly clear that there were powerful forces at play, forces whose machinations reached far deeper into the underbelly of London's artistic circles than I had initially imagined. It was early the next morning when Holmes finally spoke the words I had been anticipating. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with excitement, "I believe I've found the next step in our investigation. We must pay another visit to the Royal Albert Hall." I raised an eyebrow. "The Royal Albert Hall? But surely, Holmes, the venue is no more than a backdrop in this case. What connection does it have now?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sharp intensity, his expression revealing that he was onto something. "Ah, Watson, you mustn't underestimate the significance of that place. It is where Trevane was supposed to perform, yes, but it is also where the strings of this mystery are being pulled from the shadows. Our task is to follow the music to its source." I paused for a moment, considering his words, and then nodded. "I see. You suspect that the Royal Albert Hall holds the key to uncovering what happened to Trevane." "Precisely," Holmes said with a grim smile. "And I think it is time we visit someone who may know more about those behind the scenes. someone who might have seen what others have missed. We arrived at the Royal Albert Hall with the faint murmur of anticipation in the air. Preparations were underway for the upcoming events, and a number of staff members hurried to and fro, their faces set with purpose. However, as Holmes and I made our way through the labyrinthine halls of the venue, I couldn't help but sense a palpable tension in the air, an undercurrent that seemed to vibrate through every conversation, every whispered word. Holmes had a particular destination in mind, the office of the hall's event manager, a man named Samuel Porter, who was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his vast network of contacts within the musical world. If there was anyone who might have seen or heard something that could shed light on Trevane's disappearance, it was Porter. We were greeted at the door by a tall, thin man with a sharply combed beard, who introduced himself as Porter. He appeared both nervous and intrigued by our presence, and I could see that he had already heard rumors about the mystery that was enveloping Trevane. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Porter said, ushering us into his cluttered office. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I understand that you are investigating the disappearance of Mr. Trevane. It's a terrible tragedy. He was to perform here at the Royal Albert Hall, and the news of his sudden disappearance has cast a shadow over the entire event." Holmes wasted no time in getting to the point. "Mr. Porter, we believe there is more to Mr. Trevane's disappearance than meets the eye. We are looking for any clues, any details that could help us uncover the truth. You were here when the final rehearsal took place, correct?" Porter nodded quickly, his brow furrowing. "Yes, I was present. It was a tense rehearsal, though. There were disagreements between Trevane and the other musicians, most notably Bartholomew Harris. They had a long history of rivalry, you know?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what was the nature of these disagreements, Mr. Porter?" Porter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, it was more than just artistic differences. There was an edge to their exchanges. Trevane had a very particular vision for his performance, and Harris seemed frustrated by it. But that's not the part that concerns me. No, what concerns me is something else entirely." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed intently on Porter. "Go on." Porter hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply. "During the final rehearsal, there was a moment, just before the performance was meant to begin, when Trevane asked to speak to someone in private. He was agitated, his face pale. It was unusual. He'd always been the consummate professional, but that day, something seemed off. I didn't overhear the conversation, of course, but I noticed that he was speaking to someone in the wings, someone I hadn't seen before. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, I wonder if it was connected to his disappearance." Holmes's voice was low and deliberate. "Who was this person, Mr. Porter?" Porter's expression darkened. "I don't know. I only saw them from a distance. They were cloaked in shadows, but there was something about their presence, something unsettling. They didn't belong in the wings of the hall, especially not at such a pivotal moment. I didn't recognize them as a member of the orchestra or anyone connected with the event." Holmes sat back, clearly deep in thought, a mysterious figure. "And you have no idea who they were?" Porter shook his head. "None. It wasn't until after the rehearsal that I thought to mention it to anyone. By then, of course, Trevane was already gone. I don't know what happened, Mr. Holmes, but I feel like I'm missing something important, something I should have seen before." Holmes rose from his chair abruptly, his mind already working at full speed. "Mr. Porter, you have been most helpful, but there is one more thing you must do for us. I would like to hear a recording of that final rehearsal, if you have one. It may hold the key to understanding exactly what transpired before Trevane's disappearance." Porter nodded quickly, his face pale. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I'll have it sent to you immediately." Later that evening, we gathered in Holmes's study as the recording played through a small phonograph. The crackling sound of the orchestra's warm-up faded as the piece began. Trevane's violin, smooth and resonant, filled the air with an intensity that was almost palpable. Yet, despite the beauty of the music, there was a palpable tension that lurked beneath the surface. As the rehearsal continued, I listened closely, but it was not until the latter half of the recording that something caught my ear. Just before the final movement, a discordant sound, A brief scrape of the bow across the strings sounded out, interrupting the flow of the music. It was a subtle mistake, but one that was impossible to ignore once heard. In the seconds that followed, there was a muffled exchange of words. Trevane's voice, sharp and full of urgency, speaking to someone off stage. I turned to Holmes, who had been listening intently, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Did you hear that, Watson? That's no ordinary rehearsal disruption. There's something deliberate in the way it happened, almost as if it were meant to be heard. A clue. A warning, perhaps." I listened again, my pulse quickening as I tried to decipher the cryptic sounds. "What do you think it means, Holmes?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, a rare sign of satisfaction. "It means, Watson, that we have uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. The question now is not just who is behind Alistair Trevane's disappearance, but why they went to such lengths to silence him." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes flashing with a dangerous gleam. "We are no longer dealing with mere rivalry. This is something far more insidious, a conspiracy that stretches deeper into the heart of the music world than I had anticipated, and I have no doubt that it is only a matter of time before we expose the truth." The game was no longer a simple matter of following the music. Now it was a race against time, a race to uncover the shadowy figures who had orchestrated Trevane's vanishing act. And Sherlock Holmes, as always, was ready to chase down every note, every clue until the music stopped. Chapter 7. The Silent String. The following days were filled with a frenzied energy as Holmes and I delved deeper into the mystery surrounding Alistair Trevane's disappearance. With each passing hour, it became clearer that this case was no ordinary one. The deeper we probed, the more we uncovered about the hidden world of London's elite musical society, an environment where jealousy, envy, and ambition thrived under the guise of artistry. But there was something darker at play, something far more dangerous, and it was slowly pulling us into a web we were struggling to unravel. Holmes, as usual, was relentless. His mind worked in patterns, finding connections where others saw only random chaos. His sharp focus was admirable, but at times it seemed as though he were drowning in a sea of possibilities, each leading to a different outcome. Our next step was clear. We would have to investigate the people who had been closest to Trevane in the days leading up to his disappearance. Those who had seen him last, spoken to him, and perhaps even harbored secrets that they had yet to reveal. Our first stop was to be the house of a woman named Clara Merton, a fellow violinist and one of Trevane's closest companions in the days before his vanishing. Clara's home was a large, elegant townhouse in South Kensington, a neighborhood that seemed to hold an air of quiet refinement. Holmes and I arrived late in the afternoon, and as we approached the front door, I could sense a strange tension hanging in the air, as though we were about to step into a place filled with unspoken truths. A maid answered the door, her face pale and her movements stiff. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said in a whisper, her voice laced with apprehension. "Miss Merton is expecting you. Please come in." We entered the dimly lit hallway, which was adorned with portraits of various musicians and composers, many of whom seemed to be long-dead figures from the classical era. As we followed the maid into the drawing room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, as though we had stepped into a world frozen in time, where the only things that mattered were old wounds and unresolved tensions. Clara Merton was seated by the fire, her posture elegant, but her eyes betraying a deep sadness. She was a striking woman, though her beauty had taken on a sharp, almost haunted quality. Her hair was pinned back in a loose chignon, and she wore a dress of deep maroon that complemented her pale skin. Despite her outward composure, there was a nervous energy about her, an air of someone who knew far more than she was letting on. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, rising to greet us. "Thank you for coming." Holmes nodded, his eyes already scanning her every movement. "Miss Merton, we are here to speak with you about Alistair Trevane. We understand you were close to him in the days before his disappearance." Clara's face tightened at the mention of Trevane's name, but she did not avert her gaze. "Yes, I was. Alistair and I were friends. At least, I thought we were," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know what happened to him, Mr. Holmes. I don't know where he is or why he disappeared." Holmes studied her for a long moment before speaking. You were with him in the days leading up to the performance at the Royal Albert Hall, correct? Can you tell us about his state of mind during that time? Clara's eyes flickered with a trace of something. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. She hesitated before answering. Alistair was different in the days before he vanished. He was agitated, as though something was weighing heavily on him. He spoke of being followed, of feeling as though he were being watched, and not just by the usual critics or fans. I thought he was just nervous about the performance, but now I'm not so sure. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And did he mention who might have been watching him? Clara shook her head, her hand trembling slightly as she clasped it in her lap. No, he didn't. But he did mention someone who had been following him for weeks. He was convinced it was someone from his past, but he never said who. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now that he's gone, I can't help but wonder if it was connected to his disappearance. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but penetrating. And what of Bartholomew Harris? Did Trevane speak of him? The name seemed to strike Clara like a blow, and she winced visibly. Harris, she muttered, almost to herself. Yes, he spoke of Harris. There was always tension between them. Rivalry, yes, but also something more. Alistair was afraid of him in a way. There were rumors, whispers, that Harris had been involved in some unsavory dealings. But I never believed it. Not until now. Unsavory dealings? Holmes pressed. What kind of dealings? Clara paused, her eyes flickering toward the window, as if the very thought of speaking the words aloud might bring some kind of retribution. I don't know for sure, but there were whispers of debts, financial troubles, I suppose. When people said that Harris had made dangerous connections with those who were less than reputable. I don't know how much of it was true, but I do know that Alistair was very wary of him. He once told me that Harris would stop at nothing to be the best. I never understood what he meant by that, but now I think I might. Holmes was silent for a moment, as though processing the information. It seems, Miss Merton, that you and Mr. Trevane were not the only ones who felt threatened by Mr. Harris. And yet, there is more to this than simple rivalry. Mr. Trevane's disappearance is no accident. There are forces at work here that go beyond competition. Clara's face paled as she met Holmes's gaze. What do you mean? What forces? Holmes's voice lowered, his tone grave. Someone is orchestrating this mystery, Miss Merton. Someone who is pulling the strings from behind the scenes, using fear and envy as weapons. I have reason to believe that Mr. Trevane's disappearance was not the result of a simple quarrel with Harris. There is something far more sinister at play, something we are only beginning to understand. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the weight of Holmes's words settling over us like a suffocating fog. Clara swallowed hard, her hand instinctively reaching for the delicate violin resting on the nearby table. She ran her fingers over the strings absent-mindedly, the sound of the instrument faint and melancholic. I don't know what to believe anymore, she whispered, but I want to know the truth. I want to know what happened to Alistair. Holmes nodded, his gaze softening just slightly. And we will, Miss Merton. Rest assured, we will uncover the truth, no matter where it leads. As we left Clara Merton's home, the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. There was something about her, something unspoken, as if she knew more than she had been willing to say. Perhaps her reluctance stemmed from fear, or perhaps she was hiding something, unwilling to reveal the full extent of her knowledge. Holmes, as ever, was unfazed by the complexities of the case. We are getting closer, Watson, he said quietly as we made our way through the quiet streets of Kensington. Clara Merton may not have the answers we need, but she has given us another piece of the puzzle. Harris's debts, his associations with shady figures, these are all threads we must follow. And there is one more detail that intrigues me, Watson. The mysterious person Trevane mentioned. I believe this figure is key to understanding the forces behind his disappearance. I nodded, my mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to form a more coherent picture. And what do we do next? Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. Next, Watson, we find this mysterious figure, and when we do, we will finally uncover the truth behind Alistair Trevane's vanishing act. The game was afoot, and the clock was ticking. The final movement of the case was about to begin. Chapter 8. The shadow behind the curtain. The days following our conversation with Clara Merton were charged with a restless energy. The pieces of the puzzle that Holmes had been assembling began to shift in new, surprising directions. I could see that he was growing ever more obsessed with the mysterious figure that Trevane had mentioned, someone lurking in the shadows, someone whose influence had yet to be fully understood. To Holmes, this was no ordinary case of a rival musician's disappearance. It had grown into something far darker. "Watson, I believe it's time we pay a visit to the more unsavory quarters of London," Holmes remarked one morning, his voice tinged with the kind of calm that often preceded an upheaval. He had been standing by the window of his study, watching the flow of traffic along Baker Street, his thoughts clearly miles away. "There are elements in the city that we have yet to explore, ones that could have played a role in the disappearance of Trevane." The idea of venturing into the darker corners of London was not an unfamiliar one. We had encountered such places in previous cases, and though I always felt a degree of unease, I trusted Holmes's instincts. His ability to navigate even the most dangerous situations was uncanny, and I would follow him, as always, wherever his reasoning led. Our first stop that morning was a dark alleyway near Whitechapel, a district known for its seedy underworld, where rumors of underground dealings and shady characters were common. Holmes had suspected that Bartholomew Harris's debts, whatever their nature, might have drawn the attention of individuals who operated outside the law. It was there, amidst the grime and fog, that we hoped to find the final piece of the puzzle. We arrived at a small, dimly lit tavern, the Violinist's Rest, which had been recommended to Holmes by a contact in the music world. It was a place frequented by musicians who had fallen on hard times, as well as those who sought illicit deals in exchange for favors, some more dangerous than others. As we entered, the low hum of conversation stopped momentarily, the patron's eyes flicking up to size us up. Holmes's sharp gaze scanned the room, taking in every detail, every face. He was like a hawk in the midst of prey, ready to strike at any moment. I, on the other hand, felt the weight of eyes on me, my hand instinctively moving to the inside of my coat, where I kept my revolver, a precaution that seemed increasingly necessary in such places. Holmes approached the bar with his usual air of purpose, while I followed a step behind, trying not to draw too much attention to myself. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar running down his left cheek, eyed Holmes with a mixture of suspicion and respect. Holmes, however, was already deep in conversation. "Good evening," Holmes said smoothly, his voice calm yet commanding. "I am looking for a man named Victor Fallow. I understand he frequents this establishment." The bartender's eyes flickered slightly, but he said nothing at first. After a beat, he grunted and gestured toward a table in the far corner, where a figure sat hunched over a glass of what appeared to be cheap whiskey. The man was older, his face weathered and gaunt, his clothes ill-fitting and ragged. He had the look of someone who had long ago sold his soul for a quick coin. "That's Fallow," the bartender muttered, "but he doesn't like visitors. Best be careful what you ask him." Holmes acknowledged the warning with a slight nod, then turned to me. "Stay close, Watson. This may prove to be our most useful lead yet." We approached the table, and Fallow didn't look up until Holmes was standing directly before him. When he finally did, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Quick, but undeniable. "Fallow," Holmes said, his voice low but commanding. "I need information, and I believe you are in a position to provide it." The man grunted and shifted in his seat, taking a long sip from his glass before responding. "Information?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're looking for someone, eh? A man who's gone and disappeared, just like that." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, Alistair Trevane, the violinist. He vanished days before his debut at the Royal Albert Hall. We've reason to believe that his disappearance is tied to certain debts that involve some very unsavory characters. You, Mr. Fallow, seem to know more about these kinds of dealings than most." Fallow's lips curled into a thin, tight smile. "You've got a sharp tongue, Mr. Holmes, but sharp tongues get people into trouble around here, especially when they start asking about debts that ain't theirs to pay." He set down his glass with a deliberate slowness, studying us both. Holmes didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in debts, Mr. Fallow. I'm interested in the truth, and I'm sure you know where to find it." Fallow chuckled darkly, a bitter laugh that echoed through the quiet of the tavern. "The truth, eh? You're a fool if you think the truth's something you can just walk up and ask for, Mr. Holmes. You want to know about Trevane? You'll need to pay the price." Holmes's expression remained unchanged. "What price?" The man's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was the grin of someone who had made deals with forces beyond the law, forces that worked in shadows. "I can tell you what happened to Trevane. I can tell you who took him, but you won't like it." Holmes's eyes flickered with intrigue. "I doubt there is anything I cannot handle." Fallow leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Harris was in debt, all right. But it wasn't just money. He was tangled up with people you don't want to know. Men who deal in things much darker than just coin. Things that have to do with power, influence, and certain arrangements." He paused, looking over his shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers. "And Trevane? He got caught in the middle of it all. You see, he had something they wanted, something Harris didn't even know about, a connection, a secret that could bring all of them down. The man was dangerous, Holmes, more dangerous than you think." Holmes's voice remained calm, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. And what was this secret? What could Trevane have known that was worth all this trouble? Fallow's face darkened, his gaze shifting nervously. "I don't know the full story, but I do know that it had to do with something he found, something he was preparing to reveal at the Royal Albert Hall. He was going to expose it all. Harris, the men behind him, the arrangements they had been making. I'm telling you, Holmes, Trevane didn't disappear by choice. He was taken because he knew too much." Holmes studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Fallow. That will suffice for now." As we turned to leave, I could feel the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Trevane had uncovered something so damning that it had cost him everything. Harris, in his desperation, had orchestrated a scheme that reached far beyond mere rivalry. There were forces at play here that neither of us had fully understood until now. As we stepped back into the foggy streets of Whitechapel, Holmes was already piecing together the final strands of the puzzle in his mind. "Watson, we are closer than ever. I have no doubt that Trevane discovered something monumental, something that could unravel the entire web of corruption surrounding Harris and his associates. And now, it is only a matter of time before we expose them for what they truly are." The game had shifted, and it was no longer just a matter of finding Alistair Trevane. It was about uncovering the truth that had been hidden for so long, the truth that threatened to destroy everything in its path. And as Holmes's mind raced ahead, I could feel the excitement building. We were about to uncover a conspiracy that would shake the very foundations of London's elite society. Chapter 9. The Music of Silence. The tension that had gripped the city was palpable. As Holmes and I continued to chase the elusive threads of the Trevane case, the music of the violin that had once promised to bring beauty to the world now seemed a harbinger of darker, more dangerous things. Every passing day only deepened the mystery, and as Holmes suggested, we were on the brink of uncovering something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. Our visit to Fallow had shed new light on the forces at play, powers far beyond our initial understanding. Trevane's fate had become inextricably linked with a shadowy underworld of musical rivals, dangerous debts, and secrets that threatened to destroy more than just the career of one violinist. It was becoming increasingly clear that Trevane had stumbled upon a web of corruption so deep it reached into the highest echelons of London's artistic and political circles. The key to unlocking this case lay not just in finding Trevane, but in understanding the forces that had driven him to vanish. Holmes was already deep in thought as we made our way back to Baker Street, his sharp eyes scanning the street, as though the answers to the case were hidden in plain sight. We had barely stepped inside when he turned to me, his expression unusually serious. "Watson, I believe the time has come to confront Bartholomew Harris," Holmes said, his voice low and filled with a sense of urgency. "We have gathered enough information to suggest that he is at the very heart of this mystery. His debts, his connections, and his dealings with the darker elements of the city cannot be overlooked. If we are to uncover the truth behind Trevane's disappearance, we must face Harris directly. I nodded, though a part of me hesitated. Harris, from what we had gathered, was not just a rival violinist with a questionable reputation. He was a man entangled in dangerous affairs that could prove lethal for anyone who got too close. But I knew that Holmes would not be deterred. His resolve was unwavering, and if anyone could outmaneuver such a man, it was Sherlock Holmes. We set out immediately. The journey to Harris's residence took us to one of the more exclusive areas of London, a district that boasted grand townhouses and impeccable gardens, a far cry from the grimy streets of Whitechapel. Harris's home stood in stark contrast to the darkness that had surrounded him in recent days. It was an imposing structure, a stately building with high iron gates and a well-kept lawn that spoke of wealth, power, and influence. Holmes wasted no time in approaching the front door, his sharp knock echoing through the silence of the street. The door was answered by a well-dressed butler, who looked us over with the kind of scrutiny one would expect from someone accustomed to dealing with important visitors. Holmes, ever the master of first impressions, flashed the man a brief but confident smile. "We are here to see Mr. Bartholomew Harris," Holmes announced, his tone businesslike. "It is a matter of some urgency." The butler hesitated for a moment, as though considering whether or not to admit us, before finally stepping aside. "Mr. Harris is expecting you," he said in a measured tone. "Please, come in." We were ushered into a grand parlor, the walls adorned with paintings of various violinists, composers, and historical figures, each a reflection of Harris's own tastes and aspirations. The opulence of the room stood in stark contrast to the tension that seemed to pulse in the air. The music that played softly from a gramophone only added to the surreal atmosphere. Harris was seated by the window, his back to us. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the shadows that the evening sun cast through the curtains. When he turned to face us, his expression was calm, almost aloof, until he saw Holmes, at which point his eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Holmes?" Harris said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of something colder. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Harris, we are investigating the disappearance of Elias Trevane. We believe you may be able to assist us in understanding the circumstances surrounding his vanishing." Harris's eyes flickered with something between surprise and amusement. "Trevane?" he said, his voice laced with feigned innocence. "I was not aware that his absence had become a matter for the authorities. How? Tragic. I do hope the matter is resolved quickly." Holmes observed him with a piercing gaze, his tone never wavering. "Tragic indeed, Mr. Harris, but I have reason to believe that you might know more than you're letting on. It has come to our attention that Mr. Trevane had become aware of certain secrets that you and others may not want exposed." Harris's smile tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You flatter me, Mr. Holmes. I assure you, I have no secrets worth exposing. Elias Trevane was a talented musician, yes, but hardly someone worth troubling oneself over. If he has disappeared, then perhaps it is simply the result of an overactive imagination or a desire to escape the pressure of fame." Holmes's gaze never faltered. "You may be right, Mr. Harris, but what if there is more to it than that? What if his disappearance is linked to something far more dangerous?" At this, Harris stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sharp noise. His face had lost its earlier composure, and for the first time a flicker of anger flashed in his eyes. "I told you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know nothing of this. Whatever nonsense you are trying to spin, you will find no answers here." Holmes remained standing, his presence unwavering. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Harris. We are not here to ask for your cooperation. We are here to expose the truth. And you, whether you like it or not, are at the center of it." Harris's lips twisted into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can intimidate me, Mr. Holmes? You think you can solve this little mystery like all the others? I assure you, this one is beyond your reach. There are forces at play here that you will never understand." Before Holmes could respond, the door to the parlor opened, and a man stepped in, tall, with a hard, scarred face. His presence was like a weight on the room, and I instinctively took a step back. The man said nothing, but his gaze was fixed on us, a silent threat in his eyes. "Mr. Harris," the man said, his voice gruff, "perhaps it's time for your guests to leave." Harris turned slowly to face the intruder, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. "Indeed, I believe it is time," he said coldly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for your visit. But as I have said, I have nothing to offer you." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving Harris's face. "Very well, Mr. Harris. But know this, we will find the truth, and when we do, you will not be able to hide from it." As we turned to leave, I could feel Harris's eyes following us, filled with a mixture of contempt and something far more dangerous. The door slammed shut behind us with an ominous finality, and as we made our way back to the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something far darker than we had anticipated. The game had taken a new turn, and we were no longer just hunting for a missing violinist. We were chasing something far more elusive and deadly. An unseen enemy pulling the strings from the shadows, and we were getting closer to its heart with every passing moment. Holmes's expression was unreadable as we walked away from Harris's mansion. "Watson, the time for subtlety is over. We are dealing with forces that will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But I assure you, we will find a way to unravel them, one thread at a time." As the fog of London closed in around us, I knew that the endgame was fast approaching. And the music of silence that had once been a symbol of Trevane's brilliance would soon become the soundtrack to our final confrontation. Chapter 10. The Strains of Truth. The days that followed our encounter with Bartholomew Harris were filled with a growing sense of unease. While Holmes's resolve remained unshaken, I could sense the weight of his thoughts, the gears of his brilliant mind, turning in a way that suggested we were approaching the final act of a story that had yet to fully reveal its darkest secrets. Despite Harris's dismissal and the silent threats that had accompanied his dismissal, Holmes remained undeterred. We knew that his blatant attempt to distance himself from Trevane's disappearance was, in itself, an admission of guilt. Harris was not simply a man trying to protect his reputation. He was a man running scared. "I do not believe we have yet learned the full extent of Harris's entanglements," Holmes remarked one morning, after we had spent several hours reviewing the evidence. His fingers traced over the sheet music scattered across the table, as though the patterns of notes might reveal a hidden message, much like a cryptic code awaiting deciphering. "The true danger lies not in what he hides, but in who else is complicit. We are no longer looking at a single individual's greed. We are looking at a system of power, a network." I frowned, unsettled by the thought. "You think this reaches beyond Harris, then? To more powerful figures?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a predator closing in on its prey. "Precisely, Watson. Harris may be the first link, but he is merely a cog in a much larger machine. This conspiracy, this dark underbelly of the musical world, stretches farther than we ever anticipated. And in this case, the stakes are not just personal gain, but control over the very art of music itself." Our conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a letter in her hands. Her expression was grave, and as she handed it to Holmes, she spoke quietly. "This came for you, Mr. Holmes. It's marked with an unusual seal. I thought you should see it immediately." Holmes opened the envelope with his customary precision, and as his eyes scanned the contents, I watched his face change. His jaw tightened, and his brows furrowed in a rare display of concern. For a moment, he was silent, as though considering the weight of the message he had just received. Then, with a sharp inhale, he looked up at me. "It seems we've been invited to a performance, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and filled with purpose. "A private concert." I raised an eyebrow. "A concert? But why would someone go to such lengths to invite us to listen to music? We are not here to admire violinists. We're here to uncover a mystery." Holmes gave a thin smile, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of excitement. "Precisely. But it seems that whoever wrote this letter believes that the next piece of the puzzle lies within the notes themselves." The letter had been signed by a name I had not expected to see, Clara Merton, the violinist's wife. "Meet me at the Lyceum Theater tonight at 8 o'clock. Come alone, or you will miss what is about to happen. The music will speak to you in ways words cannot. There was no other explanation, no further details, just the cryptic invitation. I had hoped to avoid getting too involved with Clara Merton, Holmes muttered, more to himself than to me. But it appears we have no choice. She knows more than she's letting on, more than even she realizes. And now we are to meet her at the theater, where the final act of this twisted performance is about to unfold. That evening we arrived at the Lyceum Theater with little more than the letter to guide us. The streets outside were empty, the usual bustle of London muted by a heavy fog that clung to the ground. A solitary street lamp cast long shadows across the pavement as we made our way to the entrance. The theater was dark, its marquee lights dim, but the large wooden doors stood ajar, inviting us inside. The interior of the theater was silent, its grandeur muted in the absence of an audience. The velvet curtains that draped the stage were drawn, and only the faintest hint of light illuminated the seats, casting eerie shadows across the empty rows. Holmes moved forward with cautious precision, his eyes scanning every corner, every crevice, searching for something beyond the obvious. As we ventured deeper into the theater, I noticed the faint sound of a violin playing, a slow, mournful melody that echoed through the empty hall. It seemed to be coming from behind the stage, but there was no orchestra in sight, only the sound of a single violin played with an intensity that seemed almost too personal. "Stay alert, Watson," Holmes whispered, his eyes narrowing. "This is no ordinary concert. We've been led here for a reason, and I fear it may be the last performance we attend." We approached the backstage area, where a single dim light illuminated a small room off to the side. The sound of the violin grew louder as we drew closer, until it became the only sound in the world. There, standing in the center of the room, was Clara Merton. Her back was to us, but her hands moved with a fluid grace across the strings of the violin. She was playing with an emotion I had never seen in her before, raw, unrestrained, and filled with a deep, aching sorrow. Her music wove a tale of longing, of loss, and of secrets buried too deep to surface. The notes seemed to speak of something tragic, something dark, as though the violin itself had become a conduit for the pain and betrayal that haunted her. When she finally stopped playing, her body tense with exhaustion, she slowly turned to face us. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and something darker, a realization of the danger that surrounded her. "You came," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if you would." Holmes studied her for a moment before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "Clara, what is this? Why are we here? What does this music mean?" Her lips trembled slightly, and she lowered her gaze, as though ashamed of the truth she was about to reveal. "It's the last piece of the puzzle," she whispered. "Alistair?" He found something in the music, something no one was supposed to hear, something that could ruin everything, and now they're going to silence him for good. I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. The music. Trevane had been more than just a violinist. He had discovered something within his own art, something so dangerous that it had driven him into hiding. Holmes stepped closer, his voice intense. What did he find, Clara? What secret was he about to expose? She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she clutched the violin to her chest. It's not just about Harris, or even the debts. It's about the way music has been manipulated, Watson. There are powerful people, men who control more than just the arts. They control minds. And Alistair, he had uncovered their plan, a conspiracy to use music to manipulate public opinion, to sway emotions, to control the masses. I stood frozen, unable to process the enormity of what Clara had just revealed. Music, a force for beauty and expression, had been twisted into a weapon of manipulation and power. And Trevane, Holmes pressed. What happened to him? Where is he now? Clara's face darkened, and she glanced over her shoulder nervously. They took him, she said, her voice shaking. They took him because he knew too much, and now they're coming for all of us. Before Holmes could respond, there was a sudden noise from the far side of the room, a sharp, metallic scrape, followed by the heavy footfalls of someone approaching. Run, Clara whispered urgently. Now. The final notes of the violin hung in the air like an unspoken warning, and for the first time in my life, I felt the chilling weight of being part of something far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and without a word, we turned to flee into the shadows of the Lyceum Theater, our footsteps echoing in the silence, as the music of silence became the soundtrack to our perilous escape. Chapter 11. A Dangerous Melody. The breathless pursuit that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced with Holmes. The theater, which had once seemed so grand and enigmatic, now loomed like a labyrinth of shadows and echoing steps. We had no time to lose. Clara Merton's warning had been clear, and the urgency in her voice was enough to convince even the most skeptical of us that we were no longer merely spectators of a mystery. We were now its prey. Holmes led the way, his mind working at lightning speed as we made our way through the backstage corridors of the Lyceum Theater. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of his face, a mix of concentration and determination, as he calculated the next move. The thudding of footsteps grew louder behind us, and I realized we were being pursued. "I trust you know where we are going?" I asked, my voice strained from the tension. Holmes gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "We must reach the back exit before they corner us. There's a narrow alley that leads directly to the Strand, but it's a risky path. We must move quickly, Watson." We turned a corner, and the faint outline of the stage's exit door appeared before us, its red-painted handle promising a way out. Just as we neared it, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, heavy boots on the creaky wooden floors. "Quickly," Holmes hissed, pulling me toward the door. We rushed through, slamming it shut behind us, and found ourselves in a narrow, dimly lit alley that reeked of wet cobblestones and stale air. It was silent for a moment, save for the hurried sound of our own footsteps. But then the heavy door behind us rattled as someone tried to force it open. "We have to keep moving," Holmes urged, his voice firm. "They won't give up easily." We dashed down the alley, the fog thickening as we emerged into the streets of London, where the evening air was damp and cold. The lamplights cast long, haunting shadows on the cobbled streets, adding an eerie quality to the chase. It wasn't until we reached the corner of the alley, just as we neared the main thoroughfare, that we realized the extent of the danger we were in. A figure stepped out of the fog, blocking our path. Tall, dark, and foreboding, the man's silhouette seemed to materialize from the mist itself. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, and his long coat swayed in the breeze like the wings of a bird of prey. Holmes came to a sudden stop, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The man did not move, his presence alone enough to freeze us in place. "I was hoping you would take this route, Mr. Holmes," the man said in a voice that was low and ominous, carrying an unmistakable sense of authority. "I've been instructed to ensure that you don't leave this place alive." My hand instinctively went for my revolver, but Holmes placed a steadying hand on my arm, signaling for me to remain still. He stepped forward with his usual grace, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "And who is it that has given you such instructions?" Holmes asked coolly, his voice unwavering despite the threat that loomed over us. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, revealing a face that was unmistakably familiar, sharp features, a scar running across his left cheek, and eyes that glinted with a cruel, unsettling light. It was the man we had seen earlier at Bartholomew Harris's house, the one who had stood like a silent sentinel in the background. "Ah," Holmes said, his tone shifting just slightly. "I see. Mr. Harris's hired muscle, I presume." The man smiled darkly, though it was clear the smile did not reach his eyes. "You are as perceptive as always, Mr. Holmes, but I'm afraid this is where your little investigation comes to an end." Holmes's eyes flicked to me briefly, signaling that I should stay ready, but his calm demeanor never faltered. "You may try, but I assure you, this will not end the way you hope." For a brief moment, the figure said nothing, his stance shifting as though preparing for a confrontation. Then, with a sudden motion, he reached into his coat, drawing a glinting object that caught the weak lamplight. It was a thin blade, long and sharp, a weapon designed for efficiency. But Holmes was already several steps ahead. In one fluid motion, he dropped to one knee and threw a small object, a pellet of some sort, toward the man's feet. It exploded with a sharp crack, sending a cloud of smoke into the air, momentarily blinding the assailant. "Move!" Holmes shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the fog-shrouded streets. We sprinted ahead, the sound of the man's angry curse reaching our ears. We didn't stop to look back. Our only focus was the path ahead. As we ran, I couldn't help but wonder how far this conspiracy reached. The vehemence with which the man had pursued us, the sharpness of his threat, this was no ordinary criminal. It seemed we were dealing with an organization capable of orchestrating much more than simple acts of violence. We had stumbled onto something that had the potential to upend everything we thought we knew about the intersection of music and power. The rest of that night passed in a blur. We had managed to shake off our pursuers, but Holmes was still preoccupied with the implications of what had transpired. The more I heard about the conspiracy, the more I realized how deeply entrenched it was, how far-reaching the tendrils of influence had spread. The following morning, we sat in our Baker Street apartment, piecing together the puzzle. Holmes had already begun to dig into the connections between the key figures involved: Bartholomew Harris, the shadowy figures behind the musical manipulation, and of course, the increasingly mysterious Elias Trevane. We had little doubt that Clara Merton, despite her warnings, was somehow caught in the web. Whether she had been complicit or simply an unwilling pawn, her role was unclear. Holmes leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "There's something we are still overlooking, Watson," he mused, his eyes scanning the notes strewn across the table. "A missing piece. We know that Harris has connections to dangerous individuals, but it's the manipulation of music itself that is the key. If Trevane truly uncovered the extent of their plans, it is far worse than we have imagined. And it's not just a matter of exposing the truth. It's about stopping them before they can implement their final plan." I watched him closely, my concern growing with each passing moment. "What is their plan, Holmes?" Holmes stood abruptly, his eyes alight with a cold fire. "It's not just about creating music. They're not composing symphonies, Watson. They are orchestrating a new form of control. And if we don't stop them, the consequences could be catastrophic." I felt a shiver run down my spine, the weight of his words settling in. Music, once thought to be a force for beauty and emotion, had become a tool for manipulation, something capable of controlling not just minds, but entire populations. We were no longer just chasing a missing violinist. We were up against a force much greater than we had imagined, an unseen enemy that wielded music as a weapon. And time, it seemed, was running out. Chapter 12, The Dark Orchestra. The silence that followed Holmes's grim pronouncement was heavy. The implications of his words settled over me like the thick fog that clung to the London streets, obscuring everything in its path. I couldn't shake the vision of music as a weapon, twisted and perverted to manipulate and control minds, a concept that seemed far too dark to fathom. Yet as Holmes's unrelenting gaze swept over the room, I knew that he had already begun to unravel the terrifying truth. "We must act quickly, Watson," Holmes said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If what we suspect is true, then every moment counts. The power they wield through music could turn the tide of public opinion, manipulate entire crowds, even cause mass hysteria if applied correctly. A revolution isn't just started through the sword or the ballot, it can be begun with a single note, a melody designed to sway the minds of the masses." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. But how? How can they do this? How could they harness such power through something as pure as music? Holmes turned to the array of documents, sheet music, and scattered notes laid across the table. He seemed to lose himself in the sea of paper for a moment before picking up a particular piece of sheet music. It was marked with an unusual symbol at the top, a stylized eye encircled by a series of intricate, delicate patterns. It was a symbol I had never seen before, but it held a strange and foreboding quality, as if it were a warning. "This," Holmes said, tapping the sheet music with his long fingers, "is what we are dealing with. I've seen variations of this symbol before, but it wasn't until I noticed this particular composition that I understood its true meaning." He began to hum a few notes from the piece, his voice low, almost a whisper. The melody was haunting, disjointed and dissonant, yet strangely compelling, as though it sought to draw you in and hold you captive. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, the melody seeping into my consciousness like an invasive thought. "This isn't music as we know it," Holmes continued, his voice filled with a kind of awe that I had not heard before. "It's something far more sinister, an arrangement designed to manipulate emotional responses. The dissonance in the melody induces unease, while the harmonies, though subtle, are meant to invoke feelings of trust, of loyalty, even of blind devotion." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. But who would want to do something like this, Holmes? What kind of man would use music to manipulate entire populations? Holmes's eyes narrowed. A man with ambition, a man with a vision that transcends the ordinary, someone who believes that art, in all its forms, can be the ultimate instrument of power. He turned to me then, his gaze piercing. "And I suspect, Watson, that the architect of this dark symphony is none other than Bartholomew Harris." The name sent a chill through me. Harris? But he's a businessman, a manager. Surely he wouldn't be involved in such manipulation? Holmes shook his head. Harris is more than a businessman. He is a man with connections, with resources that go far beyond what we see. He's a puppet master, Watson, and the strings he pulls are wrapped around the necks of the most powerful figures in this city. He's been laying the groundwork for this musical conspiracy for years, perhaps longer. It was never about money or fame. It was about control. My thoughts were spinning, but one question kept rising above the chaos. And Trevane? What role does he play in all of this? Why was he targeted? Holmes's expression darkened. Trevane was a threat. He had discovered what Harris and his associates had been plotting, a system where music would be used to sway the masses, to control their very thoughts. But Trevane wasn't simply a victim. He had the talent, the insight, to expose the conspiracy before it could be fully realized, and that made him dangerous. I looked at Holmes, now fully grasping the extent of the situation. "So you believe Trevane is still alive? That he's in hiding?" "I do," Holmes said. "But he's not just hiding from Harris. He's hiding from everyone who has a stake in this, and they will stop at nothing to silence him." A grim silence fell over the room as I processed the enormity of what Holmes had just revealed. I could scarcely believe it. Music, something I had always regarded as an expression of the soul, had been twisted into a tool for manipulation and control. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit. The symphonies, the secretive rehearsals, the powerful figures behind the scenes. It was all part of a carefully constructed plan. "We need to find him, Holmes," I said, my voice resolute. "We need to find Trevane before it's too late." Holmes nodded, his face set in determination. "Yes, Watson, but this is not simply a matter of finding him. We need to understand the full extent of their plans. We need to understand how far-reaching this conspiracy goes, who else is involved, and what their ultimate goal is." He paused for a moment as if considering something. "There is one person who might have the answers we seek. A man who has been keeping track of Harris's movements. Someone who has been watching this dark development from the shadows." I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Clara Merton," Holmes replied, his voice low. "She's not just the violinist's wife. She's been more involved in this than she lets on. She's seen the inner workings of the network. If we want to uncover the truth, we must confront her once more." That evening, we returned to the Lyceum Theater. The fog had thickened once again, casting an oppressive veil over the city. The theater stood before us, its towering presence almost ghostly in the pale light, as if waiting for something inevitable, to happen. This time, we were not greeted by Clara Merton's violin. Instead, the silence was deafening as we entered through the back door, which had been left ajar. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the very walls of the theater had absorbed the weight of the secrets that had been spoken within them. We made our way backstage, where Holmes's sharp eyes quickly picked up on the subtle signs that something had changed. The door to Clara's rehearsal room was slightly open, and a faint light flickered from within. Holmes motioned for me to stay back, his footsteps silent as he approached the room. Peering through the crack in the door, I saw Clara Merton sitting at a small desk, her back to us. She was scribbling something furiously on a piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. The strain in her posture, the sense of urgency in her movements, it was clear that she was no longer the composed, graceful woman we had first encountered. Holmes stepped forward, knocking gently on the doorframe. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. You're here, she whispered, as though she had been expecting us. Holmes didn't waste time with pleasantries. Clara, we need your help. You know more about this conspiracy than you've let on. The music, the manipulation, it's not just about Harris, is it? There's something much larger at play here. Clara's face paled, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her own thoughts. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Holmes moved closer, his voice gentle but insistent. Clara, the stakes are higher than you realize. If we don't act now, everything could be lost. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right, I know what they're planning. But it's not just Harris. It's much worse than that. They have a far more dangerous agenda than anyone realizes. And if you don't stop them, Watson, the music will be the least of your worries. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that we were standing at the edge of something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The final movement of this dark symphony was about to begin, and only one question remained. Would we be able to stop it before the final note played? Chapter 13, The Last Note. The weight of Clara Merton's words hung in the air like a dissonant chord, unresolved and lingering. The dimly lit room seemed to close in around us, its oppressive silence broken only by the faint rustle of paper as Clara pushed her chair back, her fingers trembling on the desk. For a long moment, she did not speak, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the confines of the room, as though she were caught in a vision of a future she desperately wanted to escape. Holmes and I stood motionless, waiting for her to continue. I could sense the depth of her internal conflict, the strain on her mind as she considered whether to reveal the full extent of what she knew. It was clear that this was not merely a matter of musical conspiracy. This was something far darker, something that threatened not just individuals, but the very fabric of society. Finally, Clara took a deep breath and looked up at us, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. You're right, she said, her voice barely audible. It's not just about Harris. He's the front, the public face of the operation, but behind him are far more dangerous people. I've seen the plans, the documents, the names. This isn't about making money or controlling public opinion. It's about something much more insidious. They want to reshape the very way people think, how they feel, how they behave. Holmes stepped forward, his keen mind already processing the new information. And what is their method? How are they planning to accomplish this? Clara hesitated for a moment, her hands wringing the edges of the paper she had been scribbling on. Through the music, she whispered. It's a new form of composition, one that bypasses the conscious mind. It's not about creating beauty or emotion in the usual sense. This music, it's designed to manipulate the subconscious, to control thoughts. It taps into the primal urges of the human brain, overriding rational thought with emotional triggers. They've been working on this for years, developing a system of notes and rhythms that can induce fear, compliance, even love, anything they want. The music will be their weapon. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I absorbed her words. A weapon. Music, once a source of comfort and artistic expression, now twisted into something far more dangerous, something capable of manipulating the very essence of human will. But why Trevane? I asked, struggling to comprehend the connection. Why was he targeted? What did he discover? Clara's face darkened, and she glanced nervously toward the door before lowering her voice. Trevane was a prodigy. He understood music in ways most musicians couldn't even begin to fathom. He had already begun to experiment with sound in a way that I think frightened them. He discovered that certain harmonics, when played in a specific order, could evoke not just emotion but physical responses. Things like heart rate, breathing patterns, even blood pressure. It was unsettling. He was on the verge of exposing it all, and when they realized he was close, they moved to silence him. I could see the hurt in Clara's eyes as she spoke of Trevane, a deep, personal sorrow. She had loved him, and yet she had watched him be swept away by the very forces she now found herself entangled in. It was clear that her connection to him ran deeper than a simple professional relationship. Holmes, ever composed, took a slow, deliberate step back, his mind racing as he processed the new information. So, you're telling me that this group, Harris and his associates have developed a form of music that can manipulate the human psyche on a fundamental level. And Trevane, for all his genius, was on the cusp of revealing their secret. Yes, Clara replied softly. But there's more. The final piece of the puzzle is already in place. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Go on. Clara looked down at the desk, her hands trembling again as she opened the drawer and pulled out a piece of paper, folding it carefully before handing it to Holmes. This, she said, her voice shaking, is the final composition, the one that will complete their plan, the music that will change everything. Holmes unfolded the sheet of music, his sharp eyes scanning the notes quickly. As he studied it, I could see a change come over him. His expression shifted, hardening as he absorbed the complexity of the composition. This is, he began, his voice trailing off as he traced the intricate patterns of the sheet. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. This isn't music. It's a blueprint, a code. I leaned in to get a closer look, but Holmes held it up to the light as though he were examining a rare artifact. What do you mean, Holmes? I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he seemed lost in the complexities of the composition, his fingers gently brushing the surface of the paper as if deciphering its hidden meaning. At last he spoke, his voice grim. Each note is not just a sound. It is a signal, a trigger for specific reactions. If this piece is played in its entirety, it will resonate at a frequency that affects the brain's limbic system, controlling emotions like fear, love, anger, and even loyalty. But this is no ordinary piece, Watson. It is designed to create a collective response, a mass emotion that can be directed toward a single goal. To what end? I asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Holmes folded the sheet carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, his face grim. Power, Watson, complete and utter control. If played at the right moment, in the right place, it could incite chaos, inspire blind devotion, or even shift the course of history. It is the final step in a plan that has been years in the making. Clara's face was pale as she spoke again, her voice barely more than a whisper. And they intend to debut this piece at the Royal Albert Hall tomorrow night. The words hit me like a physical blow. The night of the concert, the night that had once promised the unveiling of a beautiful new performance, would instead become the setting for something far more sinister. Holmes's gaze hardened, and for the first time in this entire investigation, I saw a flicker of emotion, fury, righteous and controlled, pass across his face. Then we have no time to waste. We must stop them before they have the chance to play that composition, before they unleash this madness on the world. Clara nodded in agreement, her face set in determination. But they'll be expecting you. They've already taken precautions. The concert will be guarded, and I fear they will do everything in their power to ensure the piece is played. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then we shall have to outwit them. We will need to be one step ahead. We cannot allow them to have the upper hand. Clara hesitated for a moment, as though wrestling with an inner conflict. There's one more thing, she said, her voice hesitant. Trevane, he's still alive. He's hidden in the basement of the Lyceum Theater. I don't know where exactly, but I believe he's being kept there, under lock and key. He's the key to understanding this composition fully. If we can free him, we may have a chance at stopping this. Holmes's face was set with grim resolve. Then we go tonight. We need to find Trevane before anyone else does. I felt the weight of the mission settling upon me, the urgency of our task driving every muscle in my body. The clock was ticking, and time was not on our side. If we did not act quickly, we might not only lose the violinist and the woman who had become a reluctant ally, but the entire city could fall under the sway of a sinister symphony that no one could escape. As Holmes moved toward the door, I followed closely behind, my mind racing with the knowledge of what awaited us. The final movement was upon us. We were on the edge of a discovery that could change the course of history, and it was a race against time to stop the last note from being played. Chapter 14, Beneath the Lyceum. The night had fallen heavy over London, cloaking the city in its usual blanket of mist and shadow. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of a carriage rattling over the cobblestones. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, anticipating something terrible. And, in many ways, it was. Holmes led the way through the labyrinthine back alleys that wound their way toward the Lyceum Theater. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, its rhythm matched only by the rush of thoughts that ran wild through my mind. We were racing against time, racing against an unseen enemy who would stop at nothing to ensure that the final, destructive symphony was played. And at the heart of it all was Trevane, the man whose discovery had threatened to tear their world apart. Clara had been oddly quiet since our departure from her room. It was clear that she, too, was feeling the weight of the situation. But the look on her face was one of grim determination, her features set in a way that suggested she had resigned herself to the grim task ahead. She was no longer the polished, distant violinist we had once encountered. She was now a woman on a mission, determined to save the man she loved, and, perhaps, to save London itself. As we arrived at the Lyceum stage door, Holmes motioned for Clara to remain quiet. We could see the faint glow of lanterns inside, casting long shadows across the stage. The theater seemed unnaturally still, the usual hum of activity absent. But Holmes's keen senses had already detected the signs of recent movement, the subtle scrape of a door closing, the soft shuffle of feet across the floor. We were not alone in this place. Holmes turned to Clara, his voice a mere whisper. "Lead us to the basement," he instructed. "We'll need to be quick, but we cannot afford to be seen." Clara nodded without a word, her expression resolute. She stepped ahead of us, leading the way through the narrow corridors of the theater. The walls seemed to close in, the silence oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps as we descended deeper into the bowels of the building. As we passed through a narrow corridor and reached a set of stairs, Clara paused. She turned to face us, her eyes betraying the fear that she was otherwise trying to mask. "Be careful," she said softly. "The lower levels are heavily guarded. They know someone has been trying to interfere. If they catch us..." She trailed off, and Holmes nodded grimly. "We'll handle it. Stay close." The staircase descended further into darkness, the air growing cooler and more musty with each step. It felt as though we were walking through a forgotten world, one far removed from the bustling theater above. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie sense of history, old wood, crumbling stone, and the faint smell of mildew that suggested this place had not seen the light of day for many years. At the bottom of the stairs, we were met by a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with dusty, forgotten props and old trunks. The flickering light of a single candle in the distance illuminated the way ahead, casting grotesque shadows along the walls. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, his sharp mind piecing together the details of the scene. "This way," he whispered, and we moved swiftly toward the faint light. We passed several rooms, with each one locked and secured with heavy bolts. But it was clear that we were not the only ones who had been here tonight. Scratches and dents marred the wood of the doors, signs of previous attempts at entry. Clara led us to a final door, the weakest of them all, its hinges rusted and its lock old. She pushed it open with a quiet creak, revealing the dark interior beyond. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern. But it wasn't the room's decrepit state that caught my attention. It was the man seated in the center of the room, his figure hunched and his face obscured by a shadowed hood. His hands were bound, his arms draped over a wooden chair, and he seemed to be barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. "Trevane," Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The violinist slowly lifted his head, his eyes dull and unfocused. But when he saw Clara, a spark of recognition flickered in his gaze. "Clara?" His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but the name seemed to resonate with power. Holmes moved forward, his hand resting briefly on Clara's shoulder as he spoke to Trevane. "We've come to help you. You're not alone in this anymore." Trevane blinked, his gaze flickering toward Holmes with a mix of confusion and fear. You don't understand," he rasped. "They've already won. It's too late. The music... It's already been written. It will be played, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Holmes knelt down before him, his voice calm but insistent. "Tell us everything, Trevane. What have you discovered? What is the full extent of their plan?" The violinist let out a long, defeated sigh, his head hanging low. "It's not just a piece of music. It's a weapon, a tool to control everyone who hears it. It's designed to appeal to the deepest parts of the human mind, bypassing reason and causing reactions that are beyond our control. Fear, love, hate. It manipulates our emotions, creates chaos. It's the perfect tool for revolution, for upheaval, for domination. He paused, swallowing hard. But the worst part is that it doesn't just work in a single person. It works on crowds. When played in the right setting, it can influence entire masses. People will do whatever they are told. They will follow blindly without question. I could feel my stomach twist with dread as the enormity of the situation settled over me. If this music were played at the Royal Albert Hall with its vast audience, the consequences would be catastrophic. A single note could sway the minds of thousands, sending them into a frenzy, into blind obedience. But there's more, Trevane whispered, his voice barely audible. The composition is not complete. There's a final section, the last movement, that hasn't been written yet. Harris is waiting for that. He's not just controlling the music. He's controlling the composer. Holmes's eyes widened slightly, a rare flash of concern crossing his face. You mean he's controlling you? Trevane nodded weakly. He's been using me all along. He has a way of influencing the composer's mind, directing their thoughts, bending them to his will. I tried to resist, but the music is addictive. The deeper I got into it, the harder it became to escape. It was like it was no longer my mind, but his. A cold chill ran down my spine. Harris had found a way not just to create music that could manipulate minds, but to manipulate the very creator of that music, ensuring that no one could stop the madness once it had begun. Holmes rose to his feet, his expression hardening. We need to get you out of here, Trevane. We must stop them before it's too late. But as he turned to leave, a distant sound echoed through the basement. A door opening, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. They're coming, Clara said, her voice trembling. Holmes's eyes darted to the door, then to the shadows around us. The game was up. The final act was beginning, and we were caught in the middle of it. The time to act had arrived, and there was no turning back. Chapter 15, The Final Requiem. The footsteps echoed ominously down the narrow corridor, growing nearer with every passing moment. The dim light from the lantern flickered, as if in response to the tension that thickened the air. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with panic, while Trevane's gaze was one of helplessness. Bound and exhausted, he slumped in his chair, his body a reflection of the toll that the music and those who controlled it had taken on him. Holmes, however, was unruffled. His eyes scanned the room in that all-too-familiar way, as if he were already considering his next move. His mind was working quickly, piecing together the limited options before us. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, though there was no hint of fear in his voice. "We need to get to the stage, and we need to stop them from playing that composition." Clara nodded, her hand trembling as she gripped Trevane's arm. But they're already preparing for the performance. The final movement. Harris. He'll be waiting for it. "Then we will have to be faster than they expect," Holmes replied, his tone sharp and commanding. "Watson, I need you to stay with Clara and Trevane. I'll go ahead and deal with Harris." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. My heart raced, but I forced my mind to stay focused. We couldn't afford to make mistakes now. Every second counted. Holmes moved quickly toward the door, pausing for a moment as he glanced over his shoulder. "If we are not back in 20 minutes, take them and run. You can't afford to stay here any longer." With that, Holmes disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, his form swallowed by the darkness as he made his way toward the stage. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the growing sounds of footsteps approaching. They were nearly upon us. "Clara," I said, my voice low, "are you sure you can't help him? Get Trevane to his feet?" Clara looked down at the man she loved, her hands still trembling. "I can't. He's too far gone. They've already broken him." Her voice faltered. "If we don't get him out now, he might never be the same again." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The music had already done its damage, and it was clear that Trevane was more than just physically broken. His mind had been molded and manipulated by Harris and the others, a puppet to their twisted designs. As the footsteps grew louder, I pulled my revolver from my coat and checked the chamber. I could only hope we wouldn't need it. The last thing I wanted was violence. but given the stakes, I couldn't take any chances. The sounds of footsteps stopped just outside the door. "Get ready," I whispered, motioning for Clara to move to the far corner of the room. She obeyed without hesitation, her eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and determination. The door swung open with a creak, and 2 men in dark uniforms stepped inside. Their eyes immediately locked onto Clara and Trevane, their expressions cold and devoid of emotion. They had come for us. There was no doubt about it now. One of the men, a tall figure with a thin face and a sharp nose, stepped forward. "You've been found, Miss Merton," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Step aside. We have orders to bring you with us." Clara remained motionless, her back pressed against the wall, her gaze fixed on the man with a mix of anger and fear. "You won't take me. Not without a fight." I moved quickly, stepping between Clara and the 2 men. My revolver was pointed directly at them, and I made no attempt to hide the tension in my stance. "You'd best reconsider," I said, my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble, but I won't let you take her or Trevane." The 2 men exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment, I thought they might back down. But the tall man with the sharp nose didn't seem the type to hesitate. Instead, he smiled darkly, his hand slipping to the inside of his jacket. "You're underestimating the situation, Doctor," he said with a hint of amusement in his voice. "We don't answer to you." In the next instant, a gunshot rang out from the hallway, loud and deafening in the confined space. The 2 men froze, their eyes widening in surprise. I turned to look toward the doorway just as Holmes appeared, his revolver lowered, but his face set in cold resolve. "Well," Holmes said, stepping into the room with a slight smile, "I believe you found yourselves in the wrong company." The 2 men recoiled slightly, clearly unsettled by Holmes's sudden appearance and the fact that he had taken one of their own down in a single shot. But they quickly regained their composure, reaching for the pistols at their sides. "Holmes," I said, my voice a mixture of relief and tension, "we need to get out of here. Now." Holmes nodded sharply, his eyes flicking toward the 2 men. "You're quite right, Watson," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "But first, we must deal with these gentlemen." Without another word, Holmes moved swiftly toward the 2 men, disarming one of them with a fluid, almost graceful motion. The second man hesitated for only a moment before lunging at Holmes with a wild, desperate swing. Holmes sidestepped, and with a quick twist of his wrist, he had the man on the ground, immobilized. "That should hold them for a while," Holmes said, standing over the unconscious bodies. "Now, let's get to the stage." I helped Clara and Trevane to their feet, supporting them as best as I could while Holmes led the way. Our time was running out. We had no idea how much longer we had before Harris and his associates realized their plans were in jeopardy. As we hurried through the theater's back corridors, the faint sound of music floated from the stage. It was a haunting, discordant melody, one that sent a shiver down my spine. The final composition, the piece that would bend the minds of its audience, was already beginning. "We're too late," I muttered, my heart sinking as I realized the enormity of what was happening. Holmes's face was set with determination. "We are not late. Not yet." He led us up the stairs to the backstage area, where we could see the faint outline of the orchestra preparing for the concert. The conductor, a man with dark, piercing eyes, stood at the front of the stage, his baton raised. The orchestra members were already positioned, their instruments poised and ready. Clara gasped as she saw the conductor. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Harris." Holmes glanced at her briefly before nodding. "Then we must stop him now." As we moved toward the stage, the tension in the air grew palpable. Every footstep echoed in my ears like the ticking of a clock, and I could hear the faint rustle of the orchestra's movements as they prepared for the night's performance. We were standing on the precipice of something momentous. The final notes of the symphony, the notes that could reshape everything, were waiting to be played. But we weren't going to let that happen. Not if we could help it. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp. "Watson, Clara, take Trevane and find a safe place in the wings. I will confront Harris." I nodded grimly. "Be careful, Holmes." His lips twisted into a faint smile. "I always am." With that, Holmes moved toward the conductor's podium, and I turned to lead Clara and Trevane into the shadows. The final act had begun. and it was now a race against time to prevent a disaster that could cost us everything. The first note of the symphony rang out, its dissonant sound vibrating through the very bones of the theater. And then the chaos began. Chapter 16, the last note. The sound of the orchestra's first note sliced through the air, harsh and discordant, as though it were a shriek of pain. The atmosphere in the Lyceum Theater shifted instantly. An electric tension gripped the room, and I could feel the tremors of the music reverberating through my chest. Each note seemed to pull at the edges of my consciousness, disorienting me, making the air feel thick, like it was alive with something sinister. Clara, Trevane, and I huddled in the shadows of the wings, hidden from view of the audience, though I knew full well we were not truly concealed. The sounds of the orchestra, a blend of strings, woodwinds, and the deepest, most resonant notes from the brass, poured into the room with oppressive force. It was as if the music were being played directly on our nerves, each note scraping away at our composure, urging us to act, to make a choice. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though the instruments were no longer under the control of the musicians themselves. "Can you hear it?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my hand resting on Trevane's shoulder to steady him as he leaned heavily against me. The violinist had barely enough strength to stand on his own, and his eyes were wide with fear, an expression that was more animal than human. The music had already begun to take its toll on him once again, working its way into his psyche, reminding him of the torment he had endured. "I can hear it," I said softly, "but we mustn't let it control us." Holmes, standing just out of sight of the orchestra, was focused entirely on the conductor, Harris. The man's demeanor was calm, even smug, as he waved his baton in slow, deliberate movements. His eyes were locked on the musicians, his concentration absolute. It was clear now that Harris was orchestrating something far beyond a simple concert. His entire body seemed to exude a malevolent energy that permeated the room. He had long ago relinquished the role of mere conductor. He was the one pulling the strings now, both of the orchestra and of the audience that sat unknowingly before him. Holmes stood perfectly still, his sharp eyes never leaving Harris. He didn't flinch at the music or the growing intensity in the air. The only sign of his discomfort was the slight clenching of his jaw, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Holmes had an uncanny ability to resist the manipulation of others, and even the infernal power of the music seemed unable to faze him. I could see him calculate his next move, his mind working faster than any of us could follow. He would make his move when the moment was right, when Harris was at his most vulnerable. And that moment, I feared, was rapidly approaching. The orchestra played on, the music growing in complexity, pulling at the listeners like a tide dragging them out to sea. My thoughts were becoming foggy, as though the music were wrapping itself around my consciousness, urging me to give in to whatever it was that Harris wanted. For a moment, I even wondered if I was still standing on solid ground. The room seemed to sway, the shadows flickering as if they were alive. "Stay focused, Watson." Holmes's voice broke through the haze, sharp and clear. I looked up to see him moving toward the stage, his pace deliberate but measured. Clara, too, seemed to snap out of her stupor, her eyes clear once again, though the fear was still evident in her gaze. Harris's eyes flicked briefly toward Holmes, and for a moment a dark glimmer of recognition passed between them. Harris's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. "Ah, Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice carrying over the music. "I was wondering when you would show up." Holmes stepped into the spotlight without hesitation, his presence suddenly commanding, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The music faltered slightly, as if disturbed by his arrival. The orchestra, though still playing, seemed to lose a bit of their cohesion, their movements growing subtly erratic. "You know what you've done, Harris," Holmes said, his voice firm but calm. "You've trapped these people, enslaved them to a piece of music that will control them, make them puppets for your twisted vision of power. But it ends here." Harris's smile only grew, and he gave a mocking bow. "And yet, you're too late. It's already begun, Holmes. The final movement is upon us, and by the time you understand what's happening, it will be too late for you. Too late for anyone." Holmes didn't flinch at the threat. "I don't think you understand, Harris. You may have the power to influence the minds of others through your music, but I've come to realize something about you. Your own mind is just as easily manipulated." There was a flicker of uncertainty in Harris's eyes, but it was brief. He quickly masked it with a cruel chuckle. "You think you can stop me? You think you can undo what I've done?" "I don't need to stop you," Holmes replied, taking another step forward, his eyes never leaving Harris. "I just need to make sure you're never in control again." And then, with a motion that was so swift it could have been mistaken for a trick of the light, Holmes drew his revolver, aiming it at Harris. The gunshot rang out, shattering the illusion of control that Harris had so carefully built around himself. The impact wasn't what one might expect. There was no dramatic fall, no visible wound. Instead, Harris's entire form seemed to shudder, as though a veil had been ripped from him. The music faltered, stuttering like a broken machine, and for a brief moment, the orchestra seemed to lose its ability to play in unison. Harris staggered back, his hands clutching at his head, his eyes wide with shock. The power that had once been so fully in his grasp seemed to slip away from him, as if the very fabric of his control had been torn asunder. "You see, Harris," Holmes said, his voice now quieter but still filled with authority, "you believed you could use the music to control others, but you underestimated its power over yourself." The conductor's face contorted with frustration and confusion. "What did you do?" he spat. "What have you done to me?" Holmes's lips twitched into a thin smile, though there was no humor in it. "The music you created is far more powerful than you could ever have understood. It doesn't just affect others. It reaches into the minds of those who create it as well, weaving its tendrils into their very thoughts. You were just as much a victim of it as your audience will be. Your ego, your need for control, it led you to believe you could bend the music to your will. But in the end, it was the music that controlled you." Harris's hands trembled, his eyes frantic as he tried to regain his composure. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The orchestra, sensing the disruption, had begun to falter, their instruments losing their harmony. Holmes took another step forward, lowering the revolver. "The music will collapse in on itself. You have no power here anymore, Harris." The man before him seemed to crumple, his posture wilting as the weight of his own mind's disintegration took hold. The orchestra behind him was now completely out of sync, the sound utterly chaotic, as if the players themselves were no longer able to understand their own instruments. I turned to Clara, who had watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. Her face was a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For now," I replied. "The music will stop. Harris's influence will end." But as I said those words, I realized that the fight was not yet won. The audience would still need to be freed from the clutches of the melody that had begun to take hold of their minds. The final note had not yet been played, but the true battle for their souls was just beginning. Holmes, his face now grim, turned to us. "We need to make sure the audience is free of this influence. Quickly." We didn't have much time. Epilogue. The silence after the storm. The last note hung in the air, as fragile and uncertain as the stillness that followed a thunderclap. It was a silence that threatened to break under the weight of its own meaning, as if the very fabric of reality were being stitched back together after having been torn apart by the madness of the music. In the dim light of the stage, as the echoes of the dissonant symphony faded, the orchestra stood motionless, some of the musicians looking around with confused, uncomprehending eyes, others trembling in shock. Holmes, still standing near the conductor's podium, took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the room. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. We had succeeded in dismantling Harris's power, but the cost of the music's influence on the audience, those seated in the darkened auditorium, remained to be seen. "We can't afford to waste any more time," Holmes said, his voice sharp, the urgency not lost on any of us. "We need to ensure that the influence of the music has not affected them permanently." I nodded, glancing at Clara, who had visibly relaxed, but I could see the lingering tremor in her hands. The horror of what had almost been unleashed was still too raw for her to process fully. She leaned against Trevane, whose eyes had cleared, but whose body still seemed to carry the weight of the ordeal. "The audience," I murmured, my thoughts catching up with my actions. They need to be told. Holmes turned toward us, his eyes flicking to the far corner of the stage where a narrow staircase led to the back of the house. There are other ways to reach them, he said. You'll need to trust me on this. Clara stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now, Sherlock? How do we stop them from falling under Harris's spell again? Holmes looked at her with a mixture of empathy and resolve. We won't stop them from hearing the music, Clara, but we will make sure they hear it for what it truly is, a manipulation, a lie, not a divine composition. They'll be free from Harris's influence once they understand the truth. It was clear now that the battle had shifted from one of physical confrontation to one of perception. Holmes had never been one to fight with brute force unless absolutely necessary, and now, as always, he understood that the real weapon was the mind. You, Holmes said, his voice steady, and Trevane will stay here in the wings. I'll go to the front. We need to reach the audience before they leave. We nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The power of the music had already ensnared many of them, and it was paramount that they understood the danger they had been in, that they hadn't just been listening to a performance. They had been subjects in a dark experiment, manipulated by Harris's twisted vision. I helped Clara guide Trevane to a chair at the back, where he collapsed, clearly exhausted, but free of the mental stranglehold he had been under. He muttered something about the violin, about music, but it was unclear if he was even aware of what had happened. The toll on his mind was too great for him to recover so quickly. Holmes moved quickly to the front of the stage, and though he had the air of a man who could command any room, even the Royal Albert Hall felt enormous and distant in that moment. The space between him and the audience seemed to grow with every step he took, yet his calm and composed demeanor remained unwavering. As he approached the edge of the stage, he paused, turning back toward us. He gave a brief, curt nod, signaling that he was ready. Clara's hand reached for mine, and I grasped it, our shared understanding of the situation unspoken but complete. What was about to unfold would not be easy, but it was necessary. We had seen too much, felt too much, to leave the audience in the dark any longer. Holmes stepped forward, raising his voice just enough to carry across the vast expanse of the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice clear, cutting through the last remnants of the disturbed music, I trust you are all enjoying the performance tonight. However, I must now ask you to reflect on what you have heard. A murmur rippled through the audience, a confused rustle of movement, as though the attendees were just beginning to realize something was not right. Holmes did not falter. You have witnessed something more than a mere musical performance, he continued. This symphony you have heard was not composed to stir the soul, to inspire, or to elevate. No, it was composed to control, to bend your thoughts and emotions to the will of the man who stood before you, the conductor, Harris. There was a collective gasp, and the rustling grew louder, a mixture of disbelief and apprehension spreading through the crowd. Holmes didn't wait for their reaction. He pressed on. Through the power of music, Harris has attempted to manipulate your very minds, to induce a state where you would believe that what you heard was the pinnacle of musical artistry. But in truth, it was a weapon, a tool of psychological coercion. He paused, letting the words sink in, his gaze steady as it swept across the audience. You have been unwitting participants in a dark experiment, one that could have ended in madness. But fear not. Harris's control has been broken, and you are free. You are free to leave here with your minds intact. Holmes's words rang through the hall with the force of a revelation, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a ripple, the sound of whispered voices spread through the audience. The confusion turned to murmurings of understanding, disbelief, and finally a growing sense of relief. The oppressive weight of the music that had hung over the room seemed to lift, and the air grew lighter as though the very room itself was exhaling. Holmes stepped back into the shadows, retreating into the wings. I could hear the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as the audience began to rise, some of them still unsure of what to make of it, others already moving toward the exits. The tension in the room had dissipated, replaced by a quiet hum of disbelief and relief. I turned to Clara, whose expression had softened. Do you think they'll understand? she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. I think they will, I replied, glancing over at Trevane, who now seemed to be dozing in his seat, the worst of the trauma behind him. Holmes always makes them see the truth. In the end, that's all that matters. And so, with the echoes of the last note still vibrating in the air, the story of the vanishing violinist came to its close. Harris, defeated and unmasked, was left to face the consequences of his own actions. The music he had once controlled now lay still, no longer a tool of manipulation, but a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition. For Holmes, the case was solved. For Clara, Trevane, and the audience, however, the true recovery had only just begun. The echoes of the music might fade, but the memory of what had transpired would linger long after the final curtain had fallen. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.